A whistle cuts through the midnight fog, sharp, deliberate, and echoing from a place no living soul should stand. In the silence that follows, questions stir like smoke. Who hears it, and who is meant to? What if the past isn't resting, but calling out? Before we begin, I'd love to know, where in the world are you listening from, and what time is it for you right now? Let me know in the comments below. A hidden fire, a vanished voice, and a secret buried in soot. Let's begin the story. It was upon a damp and singularly dismal November evening that I found myself once more seated opposite my friend, Mr. Sherlock Holmes, in the familiar sitting room of our lodgings at 221B Baker Street. The gas lamps outside burned with a jaundiced flicker, half choked by the creeping fingers of London's notorious fog, which pressed insistently against the window panes, as if trying to overhear our silence. Holmes sat motionless in the armchair nearest the fire, his long, slender hands steepled beneath his chin, his eyes half closed, not in sleep, but in that curious state of active abstraction peculiar to his kind. His dressing gown hung about him like a monk's habit, and only the occasional crackle of the coals interrupted the thick quiet between us. For my part, I had abandoned a medical journal in favour of observing Holmes, who had not spoken for the better part of an hour. There was something in his stillness that struck me as anticipatory, as though he were waiting. For what? I could not say. And then, quite suddenly, the knocker sounded at the door. Mrs. Hudson's familiar tread brought with it a small silver tray, upon which sat a single envelope, yellowed, unsealed, and without any writing upon its exterior. She offered no explanation, save for a faint look of unease, and withdrew as silently as she had come. Holmes opened the envelope with a precision born of ritual, then held up a single sheet of paper. His eyes scanned the brief note, and the corners of his mouth tightened, though he uttered no sound. "What is it?" I asked, leaning forward. He handed it to me without comment. It read, "He whistles at night, though he's dead. Please, Mr. Holmes." There was no signature, no address, no date, only those haunting words scrawled in a shaky hand. "A child?" I asked. "Or someone frightened?" "Frightened, undoubtedly," Holmes replied, rising to stand by the window. "But not a child. Note the pressure of the pen stroke, restrained, almost clenched. This was written by a woman, likely of limited means, but strong will." He turned his gaze outward, where the fog curled along the gutters like a living thing. "It appears, Watson, that death has found its voice again, and chooses to whistle in the dark." Holmes laid the letter flat upon the table beneath the lamplight, donning his magnifying lens with the practiced fluidity of a surgeon preparing his scalpel. I stood over his shoulder, watching the curious ritual unfold. "The ink," he murmured, "is commercial, of the sort found in schoolrooms and rented offices. But the paper, a cheap pulp variety, yet it carries the faintest scent of carbolic soap, such as one might find in boarding houses or infirmary quarters. Not recent, though. She's had it tucked away, perhaps reconsidered sending it more than once." He traced a fingertip along the edge of the page. "A left-handed writer. The letters slant slightly back, and there's uneven spacing where she pressed too hard in moments of distress, especially the word dead. See how it gouges the paper?" "And the envelope?" I inquired. "Reused," he said. "The glue was reapplied by hand. Look here, the wrinkling at the corners. Our writer is resourceful but discreet, likely ashamed of appearing mad, which tells me she is not." He folded the letter gently. "There is desperation in her restraint, Watson. The sort of restraint that suggests not grief, but fear." Holmes replaced the letter in the envelope and laid it carefully beside the fire, where it caught the glow with a ghostly pallor. "There is something else," he said at length. "The whistle. What of it?" It is an auditory anchor, a detail too specific for the imagination to conjure at random. Either she has heard it, or she believes she has. And that difference, Watson, is the very fulcrum upon which our case will rest. I looked out toward the street, where the gas lamps glowed like floating embers in the mist. A whistle, he had said. At night, from the dead. There was a kind of madness in the phrase, yet Holmes spoke it with such grave certainty that I felt the chill of it settle beneath my skin. He moved toward the hearth, placing his hands behind his back. "This is no ordinary correspondence," he said. "No blackmail, no intrigue, at least not yet. This is a plea, and if we do not answer it, Watson, then we may well leave a soul to vanish unheard into the fog." And with that, the matter was settled. It was the following afternoon, the fog not yet lifted from the rooftops, and the air heavy with the acrid scent of coal smoke, when our visitor arrived. She was shown in by Mrs. Hudson with a brief and knowing glance toward Holmes, whose face, though impassive, registered the faintest flicker of anticipation. The woman who entered our sitting room was modestly dressed in dark wool, her hands gloved despite the mildness of the hearth's warmth. She appeared to be in her late 20s, though care and sleeplessness had added several years to her expression. Her features were composed, but her eyes, those grey, searching eyes, were laden with the unmistakable burden of fear. "My name is Eleanor Marsh," she said after a hesitant pause. "I was told you might be willing to help." Holmes gestured for her to be seated, folding his long frame into the chair opposite her with a grace that belied the stillness he had maintained all morning. I took up a position by the window, pen in hand, though I did not yet know what I would record. "You are troubled," Holmes said softly, "by something that does not easily lend itself to common explanation." Miss Marsh lowered her gaze. "Yes, Mr. Holmes, something unnatural, and it will not stop." She withdrew a small linen handkerchief from her sleeve, not to dab away tears, there were none, but to steady her hands as she spoke. Holmes waited, his gaze fixed not upon her, but upon the minute movements of her fingers. "It is the whistle," she said at last. "That same whistle my brother always used, sharp, 3 short notes. I had heard it 100 times before his death. He used it to signal me when we were children, when we'd go walking through the woods behind our school. But now I hear it again. Not in daylight, only at night. Always at the same hour." "What hour, Miss Marsh?" Holmes asked. 1:13, exactly. I have checked the clock." She looked toward the hearth, though I believe she did not truly see it. "It began 2 weeks ago. At first I thought I dreamt it, but it returned, Mr. Holmes, again and again. Always the same whistle. Always from the alley beneath my window." Holmes's fingers steepled. "Have you seen anyone?" "Number that is part of the madness. I've looked out. I've waited with the curtains drawn. I've kept the lamp low. But there is no one. The fog is too thick." "And you are certain it is the same whistle?" Her voice, though soft, did not waver. "I would know it in 1,000. It is his, and he has been dead these 6 months. Holmes glanced at me briefly, then back to Miss Marsh. "Tell us of your brother." "His name was Henry Marsh. He worked at the Red Fern Iron Works, just off Commercial Road. He had been there for nearly 2 years before the accident." "What sort of accident?" She shifted uncomfortably. "A fire, they said. An explosion in the foundry. A boiler gave way. 4 men were killed." "And you believe he was one of them?" "There was no body. None of the 4 were recovered in full. Only pieces. The coroner said identification was not possible, but the factory listed Henry as among the dead." "Were you satisfied with that conclusion?" She hesitated. Number Henry had written to me only 2 days prior. His letter seemed anxious, guarded. He asked me not to post letters to the factory anymore, and he mentioned hearing things, machinery that ran at night, even when the furnaces were out. Holmes's eyes narrowed. "I kept the letter," she said quietly. "It is at my lodgings. I thought perhaps I imagined the tone, but now I am not so sure." I saw the flicker of something pass through Holmes, interest perhaps, or calculation. Whatever it was, it meant that the case had taken root in his mind. Miss Marsh's voice became more composed as she spoke further, as though the act of telling granted her some small measure of order against the fear that had governed her thoughts. "I have spoken of it to my landlord," she said, "and to the woman who keeps the rooms opposite mine. Both say they hear nothing. Mr. Halbrigg, the landlord, told me it is grief, nothing more, that I have invented it out of longing or guilt. But I feel no guilt, Doctor. Watson, only confusion and dread." "You live alone?" I asked. "Yes. My brother and I had no other family. After he passed, I could not bear to return to our childhood home. I took a small flat near the school where I teach." "Have you heard the whistle every night?" "No," she said, "though that makes it worse somehow. It returns unexpectedly, sometimes 2 nights in a row, sometimes not for days, but always at that same hour." Holmes spoke at last. "And you do not believe it is your imagination?" She looked directly at him. "Would I have come here if I did?" A silence fell across the room, broken only by the ticking of the mantel clock. Holmes stood and walked slowly to the window, lifting the curtain a half-inch. "Miss Marsh," he said, without turning, "you were right to come. Whatever lies behind this sound, it is not grief. It is something far more deliberate. It was a bleak afternoon when Holmes and I made our way to Whitechapel, that quarter of London so often thick with toil, poverty, and the unforgiving churn of the industrial age. The fog clung to the crooked chimneys and blackened railings like a second skin, choking the air with a taste of soot and iron. 1,000 footsteps echoed across cobblestones already slick with grime, and the faces that peered out from behind windows and doorways were taut with a wariness born not merely of hardship, but of long acquaintance with suffering. Holmes, clad in his Inverness and walking with that curious half-limp that meant he was thinking intensely, kept his gaze low and his ears keen. I trailed beside him, noting that even in daylight, the alleys felt closed and claustrophobic, as though the fog were not merely weather, but an intent, something conspiratorial in nature. "I dare say one could conceal a regiment in these back lanes," I muttered. Holmes nodded without glancing at me. "Or one man with a whistle and a memory best left buried." We turned the corner onto Dempsey Lane, where Miss Marsh's lodging house stood, 3 stories of soot-streaked brick and shuttered windows. Holmes paused beneath the eaves and drew a long breath through his nostrils. "Observe, Watson. Even the air is reluctant here. Let us see if the same may be said of its people." Our inquiries among the surrounding residents were met with the kind of suspicion that is almost instinctive in such places, where one learns, over time, that curiosity often precedes misfortune. Holmes approached the tenants and shopkeepers with a tact I had seen him employ often, deferential, polite, and utterly in command of the conversation by the 3rd sentence. "Miss Marsh," said one woman who sold pie crusts from a wooden stand. "Keeps to herself, that one. Pleasant, but quiet. Never causes trouble. Why?" "We are looking into a matter of safety," Holmes said blandly. "Have you noticed anything unusual, particularly in the hours after midnight?" She shrugged. "Noise, mostly. But that's not unusual round here. You'd hear the devil himself if the fog would carry it." Another man, older and bent with some former injury, gave Holmes a narrow look and muttered, "Nothing you'll find by asking. The walls here, they don't speak. And if they did, you wouldn't like what you'd hear. Holmes thanked each person, regardless of what little they gave. It was not information he gathered, but tone, posture, silence. And those, he later told me, were sometimes louder than words. We came at last to the narrow alley behind Miss Marsh's residence, where the fog hung thick as wool. Holmes crouched at the mouth of the alleyway, where the street tapered into a cramped passage of cobbles and old rainwater. He brushed aside a discarded scrap of newspaper with the edge of his cane and began a slow, deliberate examination of the scene. I stood behind him, noting how the dim gaslight failed to penetrate the deeper reaches of the fog, and how even the brickwork seemed to sweat beneath its touch. "Observe," Holmes said, pointing to the base of the nearest lamppost. "Scorching, not from the lamp itself. Note the direction. This was caused by heat applied below the flame's origin, possibly from a chemical source." I leaned closer. Indeed, the blackened metal bore marks of unnatural burning, and just beneath it, a broken bootlace lay half submerged in a runnel of dark water. "Someone tripped?" I ventured. "Or someone ran," Holmes replied, and was interrupted. He moved further down, inspecting the gutter with fastidious care. "Here," he said quietly, and gestured for me to join him. Upon the brick ledge just beneath Miss Marsh's rear window, a faint smear of soot was visible, as though someone with ash-covered fingers had gripped it while steadying themselves. "Do you notice the irregularity of this fog?" he asked, looking upward. "It clings here more than elsewhere. Someone knew precisely where to stand to remain unseen." He tapped the edge of the window gently. "This was not a passing vagrant, Watson. This was intention, and it knew exactly where Miss Marsh sleeps." Holmes requested access to Miss Marsh's room, and she obliged with visible apprehension. The space was modest, its furnishing simple but orderly, and I noted a discipline in its arrangement which spoke volumes of the woman's character. Holmes moved to the window at once, examining the latch, sill and frame with the same precision I'd seen him apply to bloodstains and footprints alike. He unlatched the window and opened it outward, exposing a narrow ledge no wider than a man's boot. A faint line of smudges caught the light. "Soot," he said, "on the inside." "But the window was locked," I said. "Precisely, which means either the soot was blown in by air, unlikely as it lies only on this inner edge, or someone touched it before it was last closed, someone who reached in, perhaps not far, but just enough." He stepped back. The fog outside, the whistle, the visual blindness, all create a perfect illusion of haunting. But this trace, this humble smear, suggests something far more corporeal. He turned to Miss Marsh, who stood pale by the door. "Fear, when manufactured, is rarely distributed at random. Someone wants you to believe in ghosts, Miss Marsh. But I assure you, what walks outside your window is all too real." As we made our exit from the alley's far end, a figure detached itself from the shadows beyond a butcher's stall, a man unshaven, threadbare, and reeking of gin and coal dust. His hat sat askew, and he leaned heavily on the wall as we passed. "You're looking for him, ain't you?" he slurred. "The Whistler." Holmes paused, but did not reply. The man chuckled bitterly. "He ain't gone. He knows." "Who knows?" I asked, taking a cautious step forward. The man's face changed. He recoiled as though struck. "You tell her to stop. He sees who asks. He don't like it." Before either of us could respond, he vanished into the side street, the echo of his uneven steps swallowed by the thickening fog. Holmes stared after him for a long moment. "Drunken men," he said, "often speak truths they would not otherwise utter. We must find out what it is this one fears, and whether it fears him in return." We resumed our search in silence. Holmes's manner had grown still more intense, his eyes roving across chimney stacks, rooftops, and darkened panes of glass, as though reading invisible script upon the stones. The fog drifted and reformed, thickening in some places, thinning in others, and he followed its movement like a bloodhound trailing scent. He paused abruptly before a row of crates stacked beside the alleyway's edge. From his coat, he withdrew a small tin and cast a pinch of white powder across the wooden surface. Moments later, soot bloomed to life across the wood, outlining the heel of a boot and a fragment of tread. He said nothing, but his lips drew tight in satisfaction. "You believe someone stands here to watch her?" I asked. "I believe someone watches much more than her," he replied. "But why now, after all these months?" He looked upward, then toward the narrow gap between buildings through which the whistle might travel. "3 notes, Watson. Always 3. Not for the dead, but for the living. The question is, for whom does the signal truly call?" He turned from the alley, the fog curling around his shoulders like a cloak. "Come, the truth is beginning to take shape, and it smells of smoke." That evening, with the consent of Miss Marsh and the assistance of Inspector Gregson, whom Holmes had summoned with a discreet telegram, we positioned ourselves along the dim length of Dempsey Lane. Holmes selected our vantage point with precision, choosing a shadowed recess between 2 crumbling stone stairwells from which we could observe the alley beneath Miss Marsh's window without ourselves being seen. The hour neared midnight. The fog, as if in conspiracy, thickened to an almost liquid state, curling about our boots and muffling the sound of distant hooves upon cobblestone. The only illumination came from a flickering gas lamp, haloed in haze, and the occasional orange spark of a coal fire behind shuttered glass. Holmes stood beside me in stillness so complete that I fancied I could hear the ticking of his inner mind, working through equations unseen by any but himself. He held a small pocket watch in his gloved hand and glanced at it only once. 1:13, he whispered. "We shall now see whether the dead truly sleep." At that moment, the fog seemed to inhale. It began as a whisper on the air, so faint that I might have mistaken it for the hissing of gas through the iron lamps. But then came the notes, clear and deliberate, cutting through the stillness with a kind of dreadful precision. 3 short bursts, sharp, familiar, and entirely unaccompanied by form or figure. Holmes did not move. His face betrayed no surprise, only a tightening of the eyes as he traced the sound's direction with eerie certainty. I strained my vision, searching the fog for any silhouette, any footfall, any glint of movement, and saw nothing. The street remained still, the alley empty. The whistle had come from nowhere and left nothing in its wake but the sensation of being watched. Holmes turned to me at last. "It is not a ghost," he said softly. "It is a signal, and we must follow where it leads." Without another word, Holmes beckoned me silently toward a low wall at the end of the alley, where an iron ladder led to the rooftop of an adjacent warehouse. Though I protested mildly at the dampness of the rungs and the precarious footing, Holmes ascended with the agility of a man half his years, and I followed with what dignity I could muster. Upon reaching the top, I found him crouched near the edge, brushing away a thin layer of soot from the slates. He held up his fingers, which bore the black smudge of ash, and nodded toward a narrow recess where the rooftop met the chimney stack. "Fresh," he said. "Still dry despite the fog. Someone stood here recently." He pointed to a smear beside the chimney's base. A partial boot print, crisp at the heel but blurred at the toe, as though the wearer had shifted their weight while leaning forward. "And this," Holmes continued, retrieving a cigarette end from a crack in the brickwork. "Indian tobacco, rolled by hand, a nervous habit." "But why the rooftop?" I asked. "To watch," he replied, "to listen, to ensure the whistle reached its intended ears." The following morning, Holmes and I made our way to the Red Fern Ironworks, now half abandoned and bearing the stains of long extinguished fire. The front gate was unguarded, but Holmes insisted upon seeing the manager, one Mr. Calloway, whose name Miss Marsh had mentioned. We found him in a cramped office behind a desk littered with ledgers, invoices, and an untouched cup of tea. He was a man of stout build and ruddy complexion, but there was something in the tension of his shoulders that suggested unease. Holmes introduced us in his usual manner, and at the mention of Henry Marsh's name, I saw the colour drain almost imperceptibly from Mr. Calloway's face. "A tragic affair," he said. "Terrible accident. Boilers can be devilish things." "Of course," Holmes replied. "But you'll understand my curiosity. Miss Marsh has raised certain questions. You were his superior?" Calloway nodded. "He was promising, quiet, asked questions sometimes." "What sort of questions?" The man shifted in his seat. "About safety, about shifts being altered, about equipment that wasn't logged, just idle curiosity." "Which ended in fire," Holmes said, his voice like ice over stone, "and silence." Mr. Calloway said nothing further. We returned to Miss Marsh's lodgings just before dusk, only to find her pale and visibly shaken. In her hand she held a torn scrap of paper, its edge uneven as though hastily ripped from a larger sheet. Holmes took it without hesitation and read the brief message aloud. "Stop asking about the dead, or join them." There was no signature, no postmark, no clue as to its origin, only the unmistakable tremor of threat beneath the words. "I found it under my door," she said. "I'd only stepped out for a few minutes to fetch bread." Holmes examined the handwriting carefully, turning the note in the lamplight. "Disguised," he murmured. "But the tremor is real. A fearful hand." He placed the note gently on the table and looked to Miss Marsh. "This confirms what we suspected," he said. "You are not haunted by grief, but hunted by those who fear exposure." Her composure, which had held so valiantly, began to fray. "Then what must I do?" Holmes gave the faintest smile, quiet, grim, and unyielding. "You must do nothing. Leave the darkness to us, Miss Marsh. It is time we drew it into the light." The following morning, I rose early, prompted by a vague unease that had unsettled my sleep. Holmes was already dressed, seated at the breakfast table with his cup untouched and the newspaper folded neatly before him. His gaze was fixed not upon the newsprint, but upon the fog beyond the window, dense, unmoving, oppressive. When Miss Marsh failed to arrive at the agreed hour, Holmes made no remark. He merely consulted his watch, waited precisely 7 minutes beyond the arranged time, then rose from his chair with quiet finality. "She's gone," he said. "You mean she is delayed?" I offered, though I confess the words lacked conviction. Holmes turned toward me, his expression utterly devoid of doubt. "No, Watson, she is gone." There was no melodrama in his tone, no frantic movement or theatrical display, only cold certainty. We made immediately for her lodgings, where the landlady informed us, somewhat distractedly, that Miss Marsh had not returned from her walk the previous evening. Her bed was unslept, her coat gone, and the note Holmes had left upon her writing desk remained untouched. She had said nothing of leaving, the woman added. She looked troubled, but she always did. Holmes's eyes lingered on the woman a moment too long, then turned away. "We must move quickly," he said. "The fog that conceals may also bury." We stepped back into the street without delay, Holmes setting a pace so swift I was scarcely able to match it. He paused only long enough to light a cigarette, though I knew full well the flame was for focus, not comfort. "She would not have gone willingly," he muttered, "not without reason, and certainly not without her gloves." The detail struck me as odd, yet it was Holmes who had noted at our last meeting that she always wore gloves in public, black kid leather, well maintained, though worn at the cuffs. We passed the alley, then doubled back to the edge of Commercial Road, where Holmes knelt beside a patch of disturbed gravel. He plucked something from the ground, a button, cracked at the edge. "From her sleeve," he murmured. "Torn by force, not wear." I felt a chill settle in my chest as he rose, eyes narrowing. "Whitechapel is full of shadows, Watson, but I believe we must return to the place where the fire once burned." I understood his meaning instantly. "The factory?" I said. He nodded. "Yes. If one means to disappear something, or someone, it is wise to use the place already marked by death." The Redfern Ironworks stood like a burned-out carcass at the end of a cul-de-sac, littered with rusted barrels and soot-streaked walls. Even in daylight, the place exuded a malevolence I could not easily account for. Holmes led the way through a side entrance, long disused, whose iron bolts had been snapped and then crudely refastened. Inside, the light fell in long shafts through fractured windows. The smell of oil and ash lingered, diminished but still present. Our footsteps echoed across cracked concrete and twisted metal rails that led nowhere. Holmes paused beneath a stairwell where the soot seemed to darken, unnaturally dense. He reached down and retrieved a length of torn linen, delicate, frayed at the edges. "A woman's handkerchief," he said, "no more than a day old." The air grew colder as we moved deeper into the facility. At the foot of what had once been a storage platform, Holmes's foot came to rest beside a scuff in the dust, a disturbance marked by heel drag and resistance. Nearby, a length of cord, frayed and grey with grime, lay coiled like a dead serpent. "Here," he said quietly, "someone struggled. And here, someone lost." I found myself grasping at hope, as though its absence would unmake me. We continued deeper into the desolate shell of the building, the silence within broken only by the occasional creak of settling metal or the drip of water from unseen pipes. Holmes moved with eerie certainty, his gaze fixed to the ground, where a dark trail began to form, a sequence of heavy boot prints, dried and partially smudged by time. He crouched and touched a black residue that clung to the cracked flooring. "Not coal," he said, sniffing it, "but rubber, burned. Industrial grade. Used in insulation. A very old method for masking scent or destroying evidence." The trail led us to a corner where the shadows thickened, and there, tucked behind an iron furnace, Holmes found the unmistakable gleam of a metallic flask, empty but bearing the pungent smell of sulphur. "This was no spontaneous act," he said. "This was staged, calculated." He rose and turned to me. "And now we must calculate faster than the man who left this." A cold dread had taken root in my chest. I spoke little, for every new clue seemed to edge us nearer some grim finality. Yet Holmes moved with growing intensity, not frantic but sharpened. "There is no time for hesitation," he said, his voice low and resolute. "The enemy has shown his hand, and in doing so has made a mistake." He stepped back into the fog that filtered through a fractured doorway and added, "We must act now, Watson. Delay is a kindness we can no longer afford." And without another word, we vanished into the smoke. It was past midnight when Holmes, seated once again in the dim glow of our Baker Street lodgings, unfolded the matter before me with that peculiar clarity which often follows his deepest silences. His long fingers were interlaced, his gaze fixed not upon me, but upon the hearth, where the coals glowed like the embers of a long-buried truth. "The whistle," he said, "is not a haunting. It is a message." I leaned forward, puzzled. "A message from whom?" "From a man who knows fear better than he knows sleep," Holmes replied. "That precise series, 3 short bursts, matches a factory signal I encountered once in a case involving illicit machinery near Wapping. It was used to warn workers of incoming inspectors, a primitive but effective form of silent communication. It is no accident that Miss Marsh hears it at the same hour, nor that it comes from below her window. Then it is not meant to frighten her? On the contrary, Watson, it is meant to call someone else, but her proximity and her memory of the sound have made her the unintended listener. He stood and retrieved Miss Marsh's letter from the mantel. She believed it summoned the dead. In truth, it summoned the guilty. His eyes met mine with quiet intensity. And now we must decide. Do we answer the call? Holmes paced slowly across the carpet, his every movement deliberate, like a man assembling the last delicate pieces of a clockwork device. I could see that he had reached the centre of the matter, one he had long been circling. Henry Marsh, he said, was not simply a victim of industrial misfortune. He was a threat, a man whose conscience outweighed his caution. Holmes held up a notebook, worn at the edges, its pages filled with technical sketches and coded notations. Miss Marsh provided this to me when we last parted. Her brother had kept it hidden in the lining of his coat, a habit of his, she said. In it are diagrams of altered boiler structures and unsanctioned pressure valves. He had discovered a design, one not in keeping with safety standards, and raised objections. And someone silenced him? I asked. Yes, not with argument or dismissal, but with fire. Holmes's voice, though calm, bore the weight of moral indignation. The accident was no accident. It was a controlled burn, meant to erase both the man and the proof. He turned back toward the hearth. And now another man whistles in the dark, not out of mischief, but memory. That sound, Watson, is the last confession of a survivor. Holmes stepped to his desk and unfolded a small torn piece of brown paper, damp at the corners and smudged with soot. I found this beneath the crates in the alley behind Miss Marsh's lodgings, he said. It is part of a ledger receipt from the Redfern Ironworks, dated 2 days after the supposed explosion. He pointed to the initials hastily scribbled at the bottom. J.S. Judging from the handwriting and paper, it is not factory issued. It was a private note, likely dropped by the man who stood beneath her window. You believe this man to be a survivor of the fire? I asked. Not only a survivor, but one burdened by what he knows. He was there. He saw what happened. And yet he did not perish in the blast. His continued silence suggests fear, of retaliation, of implication. But fear makes strange allies, Watson, and guilt even stranger. Holmes held up the paper to the light. This man has chosen to speak in the only way he dares, not with words, but with a whistle. I felt the hairs along my arm bristle as he spoke. And now, he said quietly, we must make him believe he has been heard. Over the next day, Holmes moved with singular purpose, slipping into and out of the quarters of dock workers, public houses, and the iron shadows of East End labourers with a precision that both astounded and unsettled me. He asked no questions, or rather none that appeared relevant to the matter. Instead, he observed hands, boots, calluses, even the manner in which men responded to the word Redfern. By evening, he had returned to Baker Street with the faintest trace of satisfaction in his features. There is a man named Judd, he said, a former foreman at the factory, reported dead in the explosion, yet he draws no widow's pension, and his name appears in no parish registry since. You believe he lives? I am certain of it, and I believe he has sounded the whistle each night, drawn by conscience and perhaps the hope that someone some day might listen. He looked toward the darkening window. Well, Mr. Judd, you have been heard, and now it is time for you to answer. The next morning, Holmes penned several brief but carefully worded notes. One was handed discreetly to a known informant of Inspector Gregson. Another was delivered to the factory's remaining director by an anonymous messenger. A third, written in a woman's hand, his imitation of Miss Marsh's, was folded into a window sash at the lodging house. "The message is clear," he said. "Miss Marsh survived. She has spoken to the police. Names have been given. And what result do you expect?" "A reaction. The truth, when threatened, always fights back." I watched him light his pipe with steady hands, the tip glowing red beneath his fingers. "We are dealing with men who act swiftly when cornered, and if my guess is correct, our adversary will not wait for the law. He will attempt to ensure her silence. One final time." Holmes glanced at the clock. "Tonight, Watson, we set the final piece in place. It must be you who walks the alley, alone, in the fog. You must become the bait." It was not the first time Holmes had placed me in the path of peril, but seldom had I felt the weight of it as keenly as I did that night. The fog hung heavy along Dempsey Lane, coiling like a living thing about the buildings and swallowing sound before it could travel. I wore Miss Marsh's cloak, a dark garment too slight for my shoulders, and moved slowly, my footsteps echoing just faintly on the damp stone. Behind me, I knew Holmes waited, hidden, silent, watchful. The whistle came. 3 sharp bursts. I stopped. My heart quickened, though I forced my breath to remain steady. The sound had come not from the alley below the window, but from above, from the rooftop. A footstep, then another, and then a shadow detached itself from the gloom. Holmes moved before I could speak. The figure lunged, but was caught mid-motion, wrestled to the ground in silence. A groan escaped the man's lips, hoarse, ragged, terrified. When the fog parted, I saw him plainly. It was not a ghost, nor a stranger. It was the foreman, Judd, alive and haunted. The fog that night was oppressive in its stillness, and though I had walked that alley twice before, never had I felt so vulnerable beneath its weight. My cloak, borrowed from Miss Marsh, dragged slightly against the stone, the fabric dampened by the mist. My footsteps sounded unnaturally loud in the hush, echoing against the walls with a hollow resonance that betrayed each shift in my weight. Holmes had warned me that the figure might strike without hesitation, spurred by desperation and the belief that Miss Marsh had betrayed him. And so I walked with deliberate pace, feigning calm, though my every nerve strained to detect the faintest sound beyond my own motion. It was just past 1 o'clock when I heard it. A single step, then another, measured, unhurried. I did not turn, but allowed my stride to falter, as if from weariness. The presence behind me drew closer, the rhythm unmistakable, predatory in its patience. My heart pounded with unnatural force, yet I dared not hasten. Holmes was near. I knew that. And still, I felt the very breath of danger against the nape of my neck. Another step, another breath. The silence, it seemed, had teeth. There was no cry, no shout, no warning. The figure behind me lunged without ceremony, a shadow erupting from the fog with the silent violence of instinct. I felt a hand, rough, calloused, close around my shoulder, and a second reach swiftly for my throat. But before he could tighten his grip, another form hurtled from the shadows behind him. Holmes struck the man low, sending him sprawling to the ground with a guttural cry. The assailant thrashed, but Holmes was already upon him. One knee pressed into his chest, one hand securing his wrist, while the other held a short, gleaming blade, the man's own, pressed firmly against the cobblestones. A second figure emerged, this one in uniform. Inspector Gregson, no stranger to Holmes's calls. He stepped forward with admirable speed and clapped a pair of steel manacles about the struggling man's wrists. "Silas Judd," Holmes said calmly. "Foreman, former fire inspector, and, until tonight, presumed dead." The man said nothing, but his eyes, wide, glassy, wild, scanned the alley with a terrible sort of recognition. He saw nothing, yet reacted as though surrounded. "Where is she?" Holmes asked, his tone devoid of mercy. Still, Judd said nothing. Gregson nodded. "We'll get it from him." Holmes looked down. "He'll talk, but not out of fear, out of guilt." The man gave a sudden moan, not of pain, but of grief, and closed his eyes. "She's still breathing," he whispered. "But she won't be for long if you wait." The man who had emerged from the fog now trembled at its edge. Silas Judd sat against the alley wall, his coat torn at the sleeve, his boots coated with soot and rain. The light of the inspector's lamp illuminated a face ravaged not by time, but by terror. A face haunted not only by what he had done, but by what he had tried in vain to forget. "They told me to keep quiet," he muttered, his voice thick with exhaustion. "Told me the boy was asking too many questions, that he'd ruin it all. Said the fire would fix things." His hands shook violently. But it didn't fix it. It made it worse. He died screaming like the pipes had burst inside him. And then came the whistle. Every night, same time, same sound. I never meant to harm her, never. I just needed someone to know. Holmes knelt beside him, his tone neither cruel nor sympathetic. "And the others?" "Gone, vanished, sworn to silence, paid in coin or in threats. I was the only one left." Holmes studied him a moment. "Then you will help us now?" Judd did not speak, but he nodded. And with that nod, we knew we were not too late. With Judd in tow and Gregson's men flanking our sides, we crossed the silent district to the northern wing of the derelict factory. The building loomed as before, ruined, grim and cold. But this time we descended through a hatch concealed beneath a false furnace, guided by the man whose guilt had at last overcome his silence. The air below was rank with oil and mould, and the passage narrow enough that we passed in single file. At the end, through a door of rusted iron, we found her. Miss Marsh lay upon a coal-stained floor, her wrists bound, her breathing faint but steady. Her eyes fluttered open as the light fell upon her, and I shall never forget the look that passed between her and Holmes, one of silent recognition, and the distant echo of gratitude too deep for words. Holmes crouched beside her and cut the rope with a blade he had drawn earlier. "You're safe now," he said simply. She closed her eyes again, but her hand found his. And in that dark cellar beneath the ash, justice began, quietly, to unbury itself. The day after Miss Marsh's rescue, we returned to Baker Street, where the fire crackled once more in the hearth, and the city beyond the window remained choked with smoke and damp. And yet, within our sitting room, a curious calm had taken hold, a silence no longer shaped by uncertainty, but by the weight of revelation. Holmes, ever composed in triumph, sat with his legs crossed and his fingertips pressed together, the faintest edge of weariness clinging to his features. It was not physical fatigue, I knew, but a mental tapering, an unravelling of tension now that the shape of the case had been fully revealed. "Few ghosts are truly spectral, Watson," he said at length. "Most wear boots and carry matches." I smiled faintly, though the humour was as grey as the fog beyond our windows. Holmes leaned back in his chair and began, not with grandeur, but with clarity. "Let us review. A whistle, long forgotten. A foreman presumed dead. A fire too precise to be accidental. And a sister more brave than she understood herself to be." "And the survivor?" I asked. He spoke through fear, Holmes replied, but hoped all the while to be heard. He reached for his pipe. And now, at last, he was. Holmes turned the whistle over in his hand, as though it were an artifact from a forgotten war. It was small, unremarkable even, but its sound, he said, had carried more weight than any spoken confession. The signal, he explained, originated as a tool of coordination within the factory, a means of alerting specific workers to shift changes or secret meetings. Mr. Judd used it out of habit, but also of penance. He believed that if he continued the ritual, someone would take notice. And Miss Marsh, I asked. She took notice, not because she was meant to, but because the whistle was hers and Henry's, an echo from their childhood. It reached her because it belonged to her. He folded the whistle into a cloth and set it beside the ledger. Mr. Judd did not wish to frighten her. Quite the opposite. But when she began to inquire, those still invested in the factory's silence became concerned. The note she received, "Stop asking about the dead," was not from him. Then from whom? From one of the remaining conspirators. We may never know who, but their threat failed. Miss Marsh endured, and now Judd has spoken. Holmes exhaled gently. Justice, when whispered, sometimes needs a louder voice. The scorch marks discovered on the lamppost, the residue beneath the alley window, the faint stench of rubber. Each, Holmes explained, had been part of a carefully constructed illusion. They were not remnants of true combustion, but of chemical simulation, an old method employed in certain forms of industrial sabotage. A compound of magnesium filings and paraffin oil, he said. Ignited in small bursts, it produces heat, soot, and a brief flare, but without lasting flame. It's used when one wishes to frighten without alerting. And Judd used it? Holmes nodded. Yes, but not to terrorize. He meant it as a signal to any who might understand the context. It mimicked the fire that had claimed Henry Marsh, symbolic, not destructive. I recalled then the soot upon the window frame, the odd placement of the scorch upon the iron post, details I had noted but not grasped. All designed, Holmes continued, to provoke memory. But when Miss Marsh began asking questions, those who once condoned fire grew nervous again. He paused, eyes narrowing. This was never merely about covering a death, Watson. It was about burying the idea that someone might question why he died. And with that, the illusion, so carefully tended, had burned itself out. Holmes reached into the inner pocket of his coat and withdrew a folded letter, its parchment worn and its ink faint. He laid it upon the table and gestured for me to read. To whoever finally listens, I am not a brave man. I let others speak for me in ash and silence. I was there when Henry Marsh warned us. I heard what he knew. I saw how the machines were altered, how safety was sold to profit and protest to fire. I survived the blast, not by providence, but by position. I ran. I have run since. The whistle was not for ghosts. It was for memory, for regret, for anyone who might remember that men die twice, once in body and again in forgetting. Now that you know, I go. I have written no name, nor left return. Let the truth be enough. It was unsigned. He left London the same night we apprehended Judd, Holmes said. Where he goes, I do not know, but it no longer matters. The letter itself is testament enough. He folded it once more and tucked it into the case file. Some justice comes not with arrests, but with remembering. I have often pondered Holmes's manner of justice, clinical, cold to some, but always rooted in a kind of moral geometry he never cared to explain aloud. Yet in this case, something gentler lingered behind his precision. There was no parade, no triumph, only quiet. As I stood that evening at the window of our rooms, watching the fog coil once again around the lampposts of Baker Street, I found myself haunted not by ghosts, but by the sounds that echo in silence, the unasked questions, the unwitnessed crimes, the guilt buried beneath soot and silence. Miss Marsh had returned to her school. Judd awaited sentencing, and the whistle, 3 short bursts, had fallen forever quiet. Holmes spoke no more of the case, and I did not press him. Yet I could not help but wonder How many other alleys held their secrets? How many whispers were dismissed as wind or madness, when they were, in truth, the last cries of men too broken to shout? Fog, I thought, does not merely obscure the street, it obscures the soul. And it was Holmes, always Holmes, who found the pattern within it. The days that followed our return from Whitechapel passed with unusual stillness. The bustle of the city resumed as always. Cabs clattered along Baker Street, and the Morning Post arrived with its familiar rustle. But there lingered a quiet in our rooms that was not born of ordinary repose. Holmes sat in his usual chair by the fire, his violin untouched, his pipe resting cold in the ashtray beside him. He did not retreat into another case, nor did he seek diversion in chemical analysis or monographs. Instead, he gazed, often and at length, into the middle distance, as though listening still for something in the fog. I did not disturb him. It was not often that a case left its imprint upon him in such a fashion, and when it did, I had learned that silence offered the greater sympathy. There was in his bearing a weight not of confusion, but of moral reflection, something more enduring than deduction. And in that rare stillness, I saw a man not merely victorious in logic, but burdened, ever so slightly, by the truth it had unearthed. The fire crackled. Outside, the city moved on, and inside, we remembered. It was on the third day, as we sat amid the fading embers of a late afternoon, that Holmes finally spoke. He did not preface the remark, nor turn his gaze from the fire. He simply said, "Justice, when buried beneath soot and silence, must be unearthed by force, not faith." The words fell with quiet gravity, and for a time neither of us replied. There was a kind of finality in them, neither boastful nor bitter, but settled, as though he had been turning the phrase over in his mind since the case's conclusion. I laid down my pen and watched him. "There are those," he continued, "who trust that truth will emerge in time, that right will win out if left alone. But in cases such as this, Watson, where the very smoke seeks to erase its source, that trust is misplaced. Men must dig for truth, and often they must do so in darkness." He finally turned to me, and I saw not triumph in his face, but weariness laced with resolve. Judd will face what is his. But had it not been for Eleanor Marsh and her persistence, had it not been for a whistle in the night, there would have been nothing left to find. I nodded, for there was nothing more to add. Some truths, I had come to learn, required no amplification. That evening, I resumed my writing, though the case had long since closed. I wrote not as one detailing events, but as one tracing the contours of meaning that had grown in the space between them. The pen moved more slowly than usual, for I found myself pausing, often and without prompt, to glance toward the window. Beyond it, the fog had returned. It moved sluggishly across the rooftops and curled like smoke around the chimneys of London's east. To the common eye, it was weather, nothing more. But I knew better. The city concealed many things: guilt, cruelty, memory, and often it disguised them as madness or myth, whispers in the dark, shadows behind glass, sounds that came when the clocks struck their loneliest hour. I wondered how many such cries had gone unheard, how many signals had vanished into the mist because no one had paused to consider that they might be messages, not illusions. How many Henry Marshes had burned without cause, and how many Silas Judds walked the alleys with guilt unspoken. Holmes had taught me many things, but perhaps none more profound than this: that the line between the supernatural and the ignored is perilously thin, and that sometimes ghosts are simply truths the world refuses to see. As we sat once more within the familiar hush of Baker Street, the rain whispering against the window panes, I could not help but revisit the events that had unfolded. You were right from the very first note, I remarked. It was never a ghost. It was a voice, asking to be heard. Holmes tapped the bowl of his pipe against the grate and looked up, his expression unreadable. Grief may invent phantoms, Watson, he said. But guilt builds them brick by brick. And the most terrifying hauntings are often those constructed by the living. He leaned back, eyes fixed on the fire. When men bury truth beneath soot and silence, it will claw its way back, sometimes with a whisper, sometimes with a scream. What do you think? Was the whistle truly a cry for justice, or one last attempt to silence it? And what, in your view, was the criminal's most fatal miscalculation? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. And if you enjoyed unraveling this mystery, be sure to subscribe for more Sherlock Holmes cases, each one darker, deeper, and filled with clues waiting to be found. Share the story with a fellow mystery lover, and keep your ears open. Some truths return in silence,